Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our policy exchange debate on childcare, cost of the earth, how can we bring the costs under control. I'm Eleanor Mills, I'm Associate Editor of the Sunday Times. I'm going to chair this. And we did a kind of bit of a prequel, should we say, at the Lib Dem conference. And what came out of that, which was incredibly interesting, was what is childcare for? Because we talk about it a lot, but it has so many different policy goals kind of put upon it that it becomes very, what we discovered was if you really answer the question, what do we want it for? Is it just kind of child-minding for kids after they've been to school, or is it something to really try and educate 2-year-olds who are falling behind, or to try and boost social mobility? Then that's a very different answer, and it involves very different kind of costs and providers. So that's what I think we're really going to try and kind of tease out today, because I think it goes to the core of what we're paying for, why it's so expensive, what we use it for, what we need it for. So to kick off on this extremely important topic, we're going to have Claire Perry, MP.
Hello. Oh, good. I'm not Boris Johnson. I'm surprised anyone's actually here. We thought it'd be just us in the room, but I wonder how many actual members are here, as opposed to lobbyist members. No, hooray! Hooray! Woohoo! We beat the mayor. I've got 3 children. I know that's a very lame way to start the discussion, but it does mean that, and particularly in the countryside, the issues around early years education, getting involved in not-for-profit playgroups, which I was involved in for 5 years, it has a sort of really personal resonance for me. And Eleanor's question, I think, what is childcare for, is a really interesting one, because I think it should be what parents want it to be. It should be, if you're a working parent, you want to access quality childcare that fits in with your work hours. If you are somebody who wants to get back into work, it is something where you get some help essentially to get you over that childcare hurdle. It should be for all the socialisation and educational reasons that many of us choose to put our children into part-time nurseries. It should really be what parents want it to be. And then if you frame it in that, I think it starts to look like an interesting problem, because of course you'll know these statistics. This is something we've actually been working quite hard on in opposition and as a government, that we have 7 billion a year of government spending on childcare and nursery related provision from the government in this country. We spend money on 2 billion on working tax credits, we spend about 0.75 billion on vouchers, we have a big early years entitlement programme, which of course has just been extended to 15 hours, and we spend over 2 billion a year on the Sure Start programme. And that's a greater spend, by the way, than Germany, France or the Netherlands. But of course, if you look at it from a parental point of view, on average families spend 27% of their income on childcare, which is the second highest proportion of income in the OECD. So we are spending a lot and it's expensive. And then if you ask people, are you happy with the provision of childcare in your area, 60 to 70% of people will say they have problems accessing what they consider to be affordable or high quality childcare. So it's not a particularly happy sort of macro picture. And then if you look at what's actually been done to tackle this. I mean, again, I commend the last government for many things, and one of them was recognising, I think, this importance of early years intervention, trying to get involved, but taking quite a statist view of it that was, of course, based on trying to make sure vouchers went to, accredited institutions, if you like. And what that meant was that a very flexible and often the cheapest form of provision of childcare, certainly perhaps in rural areas like mine, which is childminders, population of childminders dropped very dramatically over 10 years. The numbers actually halved over 10 years. And it was for reasons of regulation in many cases. It was a demand issue, because if you couldn't spend your nursery vouchers with childminders, you would look to place your children elsewhere. And also we had, commensurate with that, a very big build-out in what I consider to be sort of state-sponsored childcare places. The numbers actually went up from 600,000 to over 1 million between 2000 and 2010. And, as places increase, you would expect, of course, the cost to go down, but that didn't happen. We had an increase, if you like, in supply, but no change in the actual cost of provision. And so, we're left with a situation where people can't access it, it's expensive, it's considered to be over-regulated, although frankly introducing quality and training into the early years space is something that I would absolutely support, as I would support paying decent wages. I've always sort of slightly hated the idea that this is something that women do along with nursing for not very much money because they like children. But it's been a real battle, sort of wrestling with this and trying to say when there isn't any money, but there is money, there's £7 billion, how do you spend it more attractively or in a more efficient way? And so lots of big ideas have been batted around, like, you know, giving it all to parents, giving them childcare budgets, trying to get in some of the informal parts of the system. We all know that grandparents play an important and increasing role in the provision of childcare, but is there a way to reward that through, you know, the state? It would be very difficult to do. So, but what we're starting with is supply side changes, if you like, sort of reduction in regulation. And just to hark back to my days on the board of the Chalk Valley Play School, about 6 years, it's incredibly difficult to run preschool education in this country, and this was a not-for-profit organisation. The ratios are absolutely crippling in terms of the numbers you need. 1 to 4 for your under 2s, 1 to 8 for your over 3s. That is some of the lowest ratios in Europe, and it has nothing to do with training or experience. You know, a newly qualified nursery nurse will have the same ratio provision as somebody who's been doing it for 20 or 30 years who is excellent. And the regulatory cost, I mean, forgive me, when having an Ofsted report, you know, Ofsted coming into the Chalk Valley Play School was like the sort of German army invading Poland. It was just this blitzkrieg of forms. You know, this was a place where we were all incredibly committed. We wanted our children to go. We did our best to reach out to, you know, it was a very cohesive village organisation. It was extraordinarily difficult. And of course, you get Ofsteded on things like your lack of completion of early years curriculum checking, which says things like, you know, Hector is, my son, demonstrating a good use of pincer grip, picking up a raisin. Well, I could have told you that, and I'm actually not paying to send him to a nursery. I want him to go so he can sit down at the table and not throw plates when he sees an apple. You know, it's a very different thing. So there was this extraordinary sense that, and it was of course very, very difficult to recruit and maintain staff and motivate staff, because if you're somebody that wants to supervise children in an early years setting, the majority of your time, I would submit, is spent form filling and managing rather than actually working with the children, which is what many people want to do. So lifting some of the regulatory burden in a sensible way, looking for exemptions possibly for the smallest organisations, the most informal organisations, of course making sure that they are CRB checks and basic safety checks, but also potentially looking at more mutualisation or agency structures. Liz Truss, of course, has just been put in as the minister in this area. It's very good on this and says, if you look at international examples in the Netherlands, they wrestled with the same problem. They basically went to a sort of agency structure which effectively self-regulates childminders, and led to a very big provision of places, increase in places, and also an increase in quality. There are some interesting fundings coming through again. My constituency, very rural, we're looking at money from the Rural Growth Network. I had somebody in my surgery just last week who said, I've been offered a job as a teaching assistant. It is insane because I cannot access childcare that would in any way make economic sense for me to do. I'm desperate to work, I've got 2 children, what are you going to do about it? And, you know, she doesn't want to hear about supply side stuff, she wants to know what you're doing to open up local provision. And finally, the thing that I like to focus on is tax incentives, which is the sort of holy grail, isn't it? We all want to tax deductible childcare, and having, yes, I know we all do, but well, first of all, you and I might want to. It's actually incredibly regressive, frankly, Eleanor. It's the problem. It works for sort of wealthy journalists in London and MPs, but that's half the room. But it's not a particularly progressive thing to do. On the other hand, and it's not very well targeted, but on the other hand, it's fiendishly expensive, and this is the problem that actually it's something. This is why no country does it, because it's very expensive. So could you target it somehow? Could you try and wrap it into other economic incentives, particularly around the workspace? One of the things I've been pushing for is to try and give parents, men and women who are on JSA, who are going on to the Enterprise Support Allowance to start their own businesses, childcare is a tax deductible option for the first 5 years of their companies. It doesn't cost anything, it's coming out of foregone tax revenue, it's a great incentive about starting your own business and the state kind of working with you on that. So I think we could do some really interesting targeted tax deductions, but you know, I wouldn't hold our breath for the fully tax deductible childcare across the board. So it's an interesting problem. I'll shut up, Ellen's waving, and let's hear some solutions.
Okay, I'd like to introduce Professor Helen Pidd, who is a serious expert, a Professor of Early Childhood at the University of East London, and has crunched the numbers like nobody else on how much this costs in the UK and across the world. And she's just done a big new report on all of this for the DFE. So.
Yeah, well, I do.
Take it away, Helen.
Thank you. I do agree that efficiency is the name of the game, and in a way, choice is expensive because, as an economist, I'm sure you'll understand that there's always a surplus. So it might be worth looking again at this notion of choice, as opposed to having some kind of coherent goal for all childcare. I've been doing a study for the DFE which breaks down the OECD family database. In other words, all these figures about how much do parents pay, how much does it cost, and so on. And this figure about Britain, the costs in childcare being so very high in the UK, is partly an artifice of the data. In other words, the data is calculated on the basis of the cost of 2- and 3-year-olds having 30 hours a week childcare, but it is given after any kind of subsidies to the nursery. And we calculate the figure before we give tax and benefits. So of course we appear much higher. However, what most countries also do is that because parents pay the nursery itself adjudicates the money and charges parents according to household income. So if you're poor, you pay less than if you're rich. It's a much, much simpler system than trying to claim benefits back, giving subsidies straight to the nurseries, and it's what most countries do.
Any specifics on the figures there and how that works?
Yeah, 15% of household income, that's the standard charge.
Right.
The other thing I'd say about the money, we do appear to have very high expenditure, both capital and as a percentage of GDP. But one of the odd things about our system is that we send children to school so early, and these school figures appear in the statistics. So if you knock out the amount of money we spend on education, you get a slightly different picture. We still spend a lot of money, but what a lot of other countries do is they don't start school until they're 6, they have a coherent system before children are 6, and they charge for it. Once children are 3 or even 2, we stop charging. I mean, it may be possible to alter the system so that the balance over the years is a bit more evenly distributed, not enormously high to begin with and then nothing, but spread out. I just want to say a bit about quality, that these OECD figures also talk about quality. And first of all, I really want to knock on the head this idea about the Netherlands. My colleague, who's Dutch, has specialised in following the Netherlands provision. And what happened when they were deregulated in 2005, was there was an enormous drop in quality. We should be absolutely clear about that. But the staffing ratios and the staff qualifications are not that different from anywhere else in Europe. In fact, it would be true to say that we have one of the most lightly regulated systems in Europe, and fiddling around with regulation is really not going to change the system very much. We need a much more fundamental rethink than that. I think really the problem, as Eleanor outlined at the beginning, is that we have a very unequal and fragmented childcare system. One of the things that the OECD data does show, that our money is spent disproportionately on the better off, and that partly because of the way it has to be claimed through tax and benefits and the high initial costs and so on. So in fact the OECD do provide figures which show quite clearly that the poor benefit least from our system, the poorest quintile of the population. So we really need a much more fundamental rethink of the system, I think.
Thanks, Helen. Lucy Lee is Head of Education at Policy Exchange, and she's also been looking into it.
Yes, thank you, Eleanor. When I first came to this topic as a mother of 2 small children, 5 and under, I was amazed at the number of figures that were thrown at me around childcare. The average family spends 27% of its income on childcare, as Helen has alluded to, and Claire as well. 20% of families have 2 parents working full time. 39% of mums work outside of normal office hours. And I thought perhaps it's actually quite interesting to frame this debate around what do parents need? And then when you start looking at what parents need, you have to step back and say, well, what is the government providing? So we looked firstly at the figures, because that was what we were being given, and we started with the 27% figure, which is from the OECD family database. And as Helen said, it's based on a family with both parents earning 100% of the average wage, with a 2- and 3-year-old in full-time centre-based care, full-time meaning upwards of 30 hours, and yet a normal working week for a mum is 35 hours. So in addition, this figure was calculated prior to the changes in the tax credit system, which is used to pay for childcare. And a report by the Daycare Trust recently has argued that 44,000 fewer families are now receiving help. So where does that leave the mums? And is 27% a true representation of the cost to an average family with both parents working full-time? Then we know that 39% of mums work outside normal office hours. So the 27% figure is calculated on full-time based centre care, but what happens if that centre-based care isn't actually available when some of the time you need to be at work? And the mums that I know who use daycare say that one of the most stressful times of the day is when they are racing to pick up their child from a nursery. So not only are they stressed because they're running late, but equally they're watching the costs mount up, because sometimes nurseries, private nurseries, will charge you if you are late. So stepping back, let's look at what other countries do. And it's quite interesting that in the Nordic countries, childcare is very much seen as a public good. For example, in Finland, early education policy is intended to support the development and learning of young children and enable them to become ethically responsible members of society. There's predominantly public provision via municipalities, and there's an unconditional right for every child to have a place between the ages of 1 and 6. Compared to the UK's position of second only to Switzerland in childcare costs, Finland is actually 19th. In Sweden, again, the focus of childcare is on the basic but very important values that I espouse as a mum of playing together, teaching your child how to facilitate meeting other little people and engaging in that activity, tolerance, consideration for others, and in contrast, our focus in this country has been very much on assessing school readiness goals of these preschoolers. So I think perhaps we need to step back from the numbers and ask the question, as Eleanor has alluded to, what actually is childcare for? And to what extent would subsidising more childcare be a good investment for government? Is it about increasing overall employment and getting more women back into the workplace? Is it about improving school readiness and ensuring that all preschoolers benefit from the opportunity to attend early years education? Is it also about the broader societal benefits of teaching social values at an early age that studies have shown decrease offending rates, etc., later on in life? Another question that I'd like to ponder on is what factors influence a woman's decision to choose childcare? And would an expansion of provision actually increase the number of women returning to work? There was a study that was done which looked at the barriers of take-up of returning to work, and it indicated that it was also the availability and flexibility of childcare that affected a mother's decision. This was the 2009 Childcare Affordability Pilot, and it offered the chance to reclaim up to 100% of the cost of the childcare if they began work. Interestingly, the take-up was relatively low. Most women cited their reason for rejecting this offer simply because they wanted to stay at home with the children. For those that were interested, it was their inability to find work that fitted around childcare arrangements. Now, there are limits to this study, and we recognise that it operated within the existing local childcare market, and the communication of the initiative was through the HMRC, so it could have had limited reach. However, it did identify the need to find flexible, available childcare beyond nursery hours. The pilot found that nearly all those who took up the offer relied on informal care, and this posed a real problem for parents with weak social networks. So to finish, I'd like to return to my first point about numbers. 27% is probably not reflective of the true cost of childcare. There are at least 39% of working mums who are juggling informal care and centre-based childcare around atypical working hours. Increasing the number of childcare places and reducing the cost is only part of the solution. Increasing that's needed for flexibility And also quality. This is an area I haven't touched on, but it's a really important aspect of this debate. And I think this is part of the key of getting mums returning to work.
Thanks, Lucy. We're now going to hear from Juno Sullivan, who's Chief Executive of the London Early Years Foundation.
Hello, and while everybody here is measuring things, we're actually doing it every day in London. I run 24 community nurseries across London, and we've built a social enterprise business model so that we're not dependent on anyone, any person or anything, because we used to be a charity, and I could see that the writing was on the wall, and that the very children that we support wouldn't get anything if we went bust. And so I've spent the last 5 years creating a sort of replicable model. I recently spoke to Mr. Gove, and I told him he should be on his bended knees before me as somebody who has actually come up with some kind of solution to an intractable problem. And it's intractable really because we haven't got a philosophy. We never have. We sort of come at this first through Tony Blair, when he figured out that the answer to poverty was to go to work, and he said that childcare was a key factor in that, and suddenly the industry of childcare began to grow at a rapid rate. Not necessarily in the best way, but in its own topsy-turvy way, even within Mr. Cameron's kind of comfortable capitalism, it was growing. And the second thing was, then they discovered a raft of research that said actually childcare is good for all children. And there's a huge raft of it, and I won't bore you with figures and stuff, but it tells a very good story. And if you look at some of the fringes that we've been going to in the last 2 days, so many of them are about young people with very little skills. And if you think that we spend £9 billion every year here on basic skills, that to kind of address the fact that we're 14th in the whole of the world on literacy and numeracy, and you know that if you get early years really well and really right, you actually wouldn't have those things, then I think we have to have a really good think to ourselves and a big talk to ourselves. And we need a real big conversation about what we want for our small children. And I think we need to think about that. And they've all given you loads of statistics, which I wouldn't actually disagree with. The one thing I would say is that I think it is about 40% actually parents' contribution to childcare in reality, which is quite significant. Because I'm with Claire on this, that while childcare sometimes comes into the press because a journalist has got her children into a nursery and is freaked out by the price of it in central London, which of course is 25% more expensive than anywhere anyway. Often it's a kind of quietly kind of mulled over sort of idea that only comes to people's notice because somebody takes a notice of it. Actually, where we should be shocked by that, because frankly, there are 2,000 children come through our doors every day, and there are, I have 350 staff. So first of all, we contribute to the sector quite substantially. We bring in about £2 billion. So as employers, we actually do some public good. So there's that factor as well to be taken into the fact that, you know, childcare can make a lot of difference to people, but actually it is only going to work if we get it right. And fundamentally, I think that in the end, it is all about the children's needs and the fact that we can mitigate so much risk. There is a lot of economists who've done some fantastic stuff on this, and my favourite is James Heckman, who did quite a lot of stuff in the States. And what he found was that for every dollar that they could invest, you could get up to $17 in return. That was before you measured things like reduction in childhood pregnancies and prisons, and all of those kind of stuff that we all know and see writ large sometimes on our streets. We also know that where we've left it, in countries that have got high GDPs, like Australia and Canada and places like that, where they've allowed childcare to be in this kind of mixed model, that actually it isn't so efficient. And it's one of the reasons it's not efficient is because it's random, and not all parents can access it. And I mean, the majority of my parents are just ordinary hard-working parents who are not necessarily in high incomes. And even though we all live in London, and now we're going to have mansion taxes and everything else down there, so we clearly won't be able to do anything at all.
No, we're not.
Then,
Then
that's just a terraced house. So there we are, so we won't certainly be able to do anything at all. Now there's been some interesting stuff done in Ontario and Canada, where they've subsidised the wages, which has been quite interesting in terms of doing it directly to wages. And there's been quite a lot of stuff done also about reducing the sort of middleman, if you know what I mean, so that the money comes straight. I mean, there is a perception in this country that private day nurseries and we're called not-for-profit, but we are for-profit because you can't run a business unless you make a profit. What we do with the profit is to invest it in the community. But there is that idea that somehow or other we're all, you know, very rich and we're all making loads of money on the profit of small children. This is not true. This is not true. I mean, to run a business, 80% of my cost is my staff costs. The other 10% is premises and rents and various things, and that leaves you very little to feed them. And all of those things, indeed. So when you come out of it, if you know, there's no margin to be made. So that is kind of half the problem here. And I think sometimes we need to have a big conversation about that. Are we over-regulated? Not really, actually. Not at all. In fact, it's exactly that point. What we need is some to be kind of allowed for the interpretation of regulation. So it's a bit like health and safety. You know, you have a piece of legislation, but it can be interpreted in so many ways. And what you find is local authorities, because they're the gatekeepers of public money, they have their own rules about what makes them feel safe about money they give out. So we could be subject to all 152 different interpretations, which becomes quite complex. The other thing is, you're quite right about business rates, VAT, business rates, premises, leases, all of those things. I mean, local authorities don't understand the thing about leases. They don't get it. They think it's all right to have this conversation going on for a year when you're trying to run a nursery in St. Tower Hamlets. There are key things around VAT. That's not coverable. I mean, those are the things that actually we need to be looking at regulation, not actually the idea that the ratios. If Mumsnet said, when they looked at ratios, parents actually, they want the high ratios. You know, people only have 2 hips. These children are small. And the fact that you're really qualified does not stop you having to pick them up and look after them. We want really good, engaged relationships with our small children. We know all about brain development. Why would we reduce the number of staff there? And children have their own little ways and their own little idiosyncrasies, and you have to have staff that understand that. And that is really important. And I left my child in a nursery, and you know what mattered to me was that one of her key person understood that you had to put the steps up at the window for me to say goodbye to her, and then she would be happy all day. It's those little things, and you can't have that if you have some super qualified person but she still only has 2 hips and she still only has one set of eyes. So I think this thing about deregulation, we really need to get our act together on this and really look at business deregulation and stuff and some of the red tape around employment law, because if 80% of my costs are on staff and I'm stuck with some staff member who really should be working for Tesco, it takes me nearly 9 months to get rid of a member of staff. Now, children haven't time for that. They haven't time, and especially if they come from difficult backgrounds, they haven't time to be stuck with someone who's demotivated and you're sending her on training and you're sending her this, that and the other, and you're still not getting a change. We had 4 questions to answer. More nurseries and more childminders. I don't mind. You know, what parents want, up to them. I worked for childminders for 10 years. I was an under-8 social worker in Battersea. I started with 2 and I ended up with 92. What I found was that childminders need support. What causes divorce? Parents, children and money. So just imagine you're a childminder, you're dealing with those kind of relationships on your own in your house. You know, the tension and the difficulty is going to be quite high. So you need some support. You need some. So the idea that, you know, you can just have loads and loads of childminders and that they're all going to be okay is not such a good idea. We really need to think about, is this good for children? There is an interesting policy we need to have a look at, which is the 0 to 11 policy, because I'm with Helen. We send our children to school far too early. It's disgraceful. It's disgraceful that we're thinking of putting some of our 2-year-olds in schools. So what we have to get our head around is, what is education for small children all about? So if in the end we have to put them in settings that are called schools, we don't confuse education with schooling. We think about what is important for those small children. And I don't mind where they go. I work really well with academies. I work well with anyone, really. In the end, it's not the child's fault where they end up. It's our responsibility to make sure that when they're there, they have a nice time and they have a happy time. And there's a big debate between education and entertainment. And you know, the fact is, fun is necessary, is often very educational. And it's nice for them to have a nice fun time and to have a little joke and to have, you know, the ability to be in and out and to roll in the mud and not be worried about any of those things. And it's probably less nice for grown-ups who don't know a lot about childcare to come in and say that they should be sitting around tables. Well, no, not all day they shouldn't. No, they're only 2. And they're only babies. And finally, I am so depressed sometimes by, you know, what happened to all our feminism in the 1970s? You know, I see so many of my parents come in and they feel so guilty about leaving their children. Why the hell should they? You know, the women have worked really hard. We have glass ceilings, glass elevators and everything else. We work really hard to get to a position of power, even in a small job. You know, it doesn't matter, because we're not all fanciful, highfalutin people. And you get to that point, and you'll then feel guilty because you want to leave your child in a perfectly good nursery with perfectly nice staff, with perfectly nice children. So why shouldn't you? And frankly, the other thing is, every time there's an economic situation going on, as there is now, women get the blame for it quite often. So they have to stay at home, they have to go back, and suddenly the whole thing about it's bad for children. In fact, what the research says is that it's not necessarily good for children to stay at home with their mother sometimes. And interesting, the question was about mothers. You know, we leave the whole issue of fathers for a minute.
Right.
Yeah, so I think just to conclude then, I would say to you that, you know, we need to think about what we want for our children. We need to think about the fact that we have high rates of single parents. They need to work too. We need to think about always the kind of blame game that goes on. Oh, nurseries are ripping everybody off, you know, because we're all going to be rich. Parents, mothers are awful because they're leaving their children in these desperate places. All the children are going to be disadvantaged and terrible, and they can't read and write. They can't read and write now and they're at home. So what difference, you know, so we have to do something. And I think until we have a big grown-up conversation with ourselves about what we actually want for our children, and how we can show the world that lots of the stuff that we've done for children, from the previous government as much as this government, and indeed I hope with the future government, that actually we have to weave policy, regulation, training, qualification, funding, and the sort of provisions where we feel are good enough into a coherent policy that we support and that actually does well for our children and for our future. Thank you.
Very good.
I think you'll all agree we've had some very spirited arguments around all of this issue. I'm sure you've all got lots of questions, so let's do a bit of a kind of question and answer session. Yes, the chap in the blue shirt.
Hello there.
Can you say who you are?
My name is Christopher Miller. I'm a member. I come from Salisbury. Claire,
Yes.
you may be able to correct me on this, but my understanding was that in Singapore they had a very successful approach to tax refunds for people who have childcare. So we're not Singapore. There are lots of things about Singapore that we wouldn't want. It's possible. Sorry, I'm going to go for two for the price of one here. I don't have a micro solution to what we're talking about, but I do have a perspective which is a bit more macro for the whole economy. And it comes from this idea that, I think I'm right in saying, humans are probably, I think they're the only creatures in the animal kingdom where women have a useful life beyond their reproductive years. And the argument goes that...
And before and during, arguably.
The argument goes that the evolutionary reason for this is so that they can look after the children while the parents of the children are working in the fields. And I don't know, maybe that gives some ideas.
Sorry, your question is?
Well,
we have questions for the speakers.
What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, Singapore, I don't honestly know, Chris. I mean, we looked at, for example, a group of female MPs in my party looked at whether you could offer tax deductibility for self-employed people as a unit, and through basically extending the voucher scheme to self-employed people, and we got in the voucher providers, and it's it's like 5 billion quid up to deal with the current levels of self-employment. And that's actually a lovely policy goal, but there isn't money for this, and we are already spending rather substantial chunks of money through the government anyway. So I think it is an interesting goal. Again, it's also back to this issue of targeting, that it doesn't necessarily target the people, particularly the most disadvantaged families who might need it the most. On the sort of baboon theory, I mean, you're right. Look, I am approaching the end of my reproductive years, but I would like to keep working, and I think there is a sense of, in an ideal world, we would want different things. Of course, it's wonderful to have grandparents, I believe, provide about 25% of informal childcare anyway, help out their families. It's a hugely, hugely valuable resource. But we are going to have to keep working longer, and we're going to be in and frankly, for people like me, I now have to start worrying about looking after my parents as well as my kids. So there's a nasty care crunch developing that will continue to run, which actually raises all sorts of interesting policy questions for whether we could use Sure Start centres for older child and elder care, frankly. So there are interesting ideas, but I just think we need to accept where we are and say, actually, we've got a very mixed economy in childcare. What I've heard a lot about is scale. I mean, you've done the most amazing, definition of what would happen if we didn't have lots of cottage industries of childminders and individual nurseries. There's obviously lots of solutions that could be solved better, including regulation at a bigger scale. But I think we have to start with where we are and say, how can we improve it?
Yes.
Bishop McIntyre, early a professional, and I'll be coming from, I agree with the majority of what you guys have said. But I think for a voluntary nursery place, the government needs to start looking at reducing this corporation tax business and the business rate if they want a real low-cost childcare, because that's why businesses put those taxes back on the childcare, and it becomes difficult. The second thing my suggestion is that the payment of qualified staff. We've been lobbying for the teaching agency to acknowledge the early year professional status, because I chose not to be a teacher because I want to provide education and care, a true play, and that's not crime, because I've seen the London riot way before it happened. For children who doesn't have the social care interaction, and it's always push for maths and English and writing, and they're not ready for it. So we have the combination of the forest, the I can't remember all the theorists, but we put that together and try to provide a childcare provision through play. But what's killing childcare costs is that there's no acknowledgement, because the women's area is being underpaid. The person who pick up a rubbish on the streets, a man, gets 350 a week. A nursery nurse gets less than 200 a week. And they pick up children all the time, they change nappies, and that's been extremely stressful. Government needs to look into that and making sure that women, these wages, it does match, because it's about equal pay, it's about respecting people, respecting what they want to do for the sake of our children. Thank you.
Yes, can we have questions? I don't have to make your point, but...
Sorry, my point is looking at how government can help to boost pay for the women who are working early years, educated nursery nurses. That's the first step. And then making sure early year professionals who choose not to be a teacher get recognized. That's my question.
Thank you. Lady in pink.
I'm Emily Owens. I'm a member in Battersea. I'm also a governor of the state nursery school. And I just had a question on the future of some of our state nursery schools, because in the last couple of years we've all been, as parents, been able to take subsidy for 4 or 5 terms for nursery provision. And a lot of people have been using it in the private nursery sector, but also in wraparound all-day nurseries. And we've certainly seen in our nursery, which for many years has been rated Ofsted outstanding, that there are actually now more places than there are applicants. So I have a question around that, and that's in the London way. Obviously you said, there are problems in terms of finding places. The other question, back to your Finland point, sort of saying obviously children clearly go to school far later in Europe, and in Finland I think it's at the age of 7. But at the age of 9, they are ahead of us in literacy and numeracy. So why are our children going to school at the age of 4?
Helen, do you want to come in on that?
Well, I do think we have an absolutely terrific tradition of nursery education in this country. I mean, we were world leaders for a long time in nursery education, and people look to us for examples of how it might be done. And we've let all that slip. I mean, I think that we should have thought much harder about what we can do with our nursery schools and how they might be transformed and provide a much broader service, and that never really happened. And it's such a pity, because other countries have now caught up with this. In terms of school, well, I do think 5 or 4 now is very early for children to start regular school, not nursery school, regular. Well, 4, 2, 3, 4. It's early, and it's a mistake. And I think we should really look very hard at how we're doing that and rethink it. But on the other hand, school is a very valuable resource for parents rather than children.
Yeah, I was going to say, you want to come in.
Are you talking about Somerset School?
Yes.
Yes, I know well. There is a real, you picked up an interesting point, because with all of this going on, partly there have been some bad decisions made along the way, and one of them, which Claire will pick up from the NDNA, but quite often what happened when they introduced Sure Start is they also built extra nurseries, not necessarily auditing out what was already there and stuff. So there's a bit of that, and we're still picking up on that. The offer of free childcare, 15 hours, and free for the 2-year-olds. You know, I have a real issue about the word free and about the appreciation of it. And I think the 2-year-old thing actually is a missed opportunity, because for me, if you're working with parents from 40% most disadvantaged areas and we're giving them free 15 hours, then we should really be thinking about giving them a plan, a parenting plan to go with it. Now, whether they want to work or they're at college, I don't really mind, but the idea of free always means it devalues, and I think that there is something around that. Now, if you say, on the other hand, that the whole country is going to have a statutory duty to provide a free universal offer to all children from 1 up to 6, and that it's built in, like so many other countries, then that's another thing. But at the moment we've got this complete confusion in our minds about it. And as a consequence, we have lots of places. We have a real problem filling our places because the very parents that need us can't really afford us. And even with our business model, which is pretty smart and pretty flexible, we still can't offer all of them everything they want. And the other thing about kinship in London is that there aren't great networks of grandparents, and there aren't great networks of families and extended families, particularly in some of the boroughs I work in, which are like Westminster, where you have a 25% turnover of families every year. And Barking and Dagenham, which high turnover as well. So you're trying to figure out the role, the nursery role in supporting some of this stuff as well, free. And so what's happening is that children are getting this so-called wraparound care. Well, the wraparound care, guys, is a proper nursery. So you have them with an hour here and someone else is picking them up here. And there is a big and interesting discussion, and we're about to have it actually at the Social Enterprise Day in London, if any of you want to come, about this idea of flexible working and part-time working for parents as well. And there is a role that we as employers could do a bit more about, and things like tax benefits to us, for example, through tax relief for reducing the fees for our own staff actually for childcare, and looking at some of those kind of relaxations around some of the tax. So I do think there's a fiscal contribution, but I suppose, feel that in some ways the childcare sector is resonant of the government departments. They're all in little silos, and then they're all vetoed by the Treasury anyway. So, you know, that is a real problem.
Can I actually comment on that point? Because the conversation is very much focused on early years, which I have somebody who believes in very early intervention I support. But, you know, the big issue as a working MP is school holidays, you know, pickups from school. It's all that stuff that then really crunches when you've done the nappy bit. You can see yourself getting back in the workforce. Your brain's recovered from the estrogen, so you can actually contribute. And you are utterly stuffed for 35 weeks of the year. And to your point about flexibility again, look, we have got a very mixed market. I'm interested in the problem. I don't actually know if we've got enough places or not across the country. I think we've got pockets. We've actually provided a lot of places. I have no idea whether we have surplus or not. I'm kind of relaxed about that because I think we'll continue to have children. We'll take up the surplus. But why are we not saying, the Pusey Sure Start Centre, which is run by 4 children, is a fantastic building that was opened. Why is it not being used for holiday clubs, for, after school pickups for parents to drop off? It's utterly siloed. We think about it depending on the funding stream, and it drives me insane. And that is the biggest disincentive actually that's when the glass ceiling really starts to bite, when you have to bugger off from a select committee hearing to collect your children, frankly. So it's not great. And the other thing I would say is, the other thing I'm interested in is the whole wraparound at the school, the secondary and primary school, and Helen might have views on this, because that's been one of the innovations that's come in with the free schools, which I think are introducing a kind of catalytic kind of innovation sense in the educational sector. I'm a governor of 2 secondary schools in my constituency, and it's something that we talk about. Should we be actually thinking about the broader wraparound care? But is that potentially putting it into silos again? I don't know. We just need more of it for different ages, I think.
Just quickly, two points that I'd quite like to make. The provision of the free entitlement for 2-year-olds is very interesting. I think clearly it's obviously targeted at the deprived 2-year-olds. However, from what we've looked at, we know that around 80% provision is private sector, and that actually it's quite hard to get a place in a private nursery to do your free entitlement. So it should just be recognised that when parents are going out into to find their childcare, and if they are looking for those 15 hours a week, it is quite challenging to find those hours specifically, because typically private nurseries will look to fill their places for the entire week, or at least for a certain block of days. And then the other thing I'd like to pick up on, I think, is the importance of distinguishing very much with these different funding streams, which is an issue that we've identified as well. And I think equally you've got children's centres, Sure Start, and then you've got childcare provision and daycare nurseries. And all these different grants, funding mechanisms are creating complete confusion. And we really do need to start looking at trying to simplify this, not only for the providers but also for the parents.
The lady with the red hair.
Hi, I'm Kath Chris from Play England, and we campaign for children's right to play. We also work with play workers and the play work sector, and people keep forgetting that the play sector, adventure playgrounds, holiday play schemes, after school clubs, outreach play ranges is also part of the childcare tapestry, and it's that open access provision, especially for the 6 to 15-year-olds who can, you know, I went to visit an adventure playground at the top of Hackney, who worked with a local primary school the other week. They are desperately trying to keep open from sort of 4 till 6 p.m, 4 till 8 p.m. every night after school and at the weekend, so that the kids have somewhere safe and fantastic to go, and they can learn so much there. And yet most people have never even heard of adventure playground. And it's relatively extremely cost effective, and yet some boroughs like Wandsworth have now closed down their staffed play provision instead of recognising it as part of that fantastic patchwork. Opening up and making sure we retain play ranges in parks and staffed play provision is one part of the childcare sector that ought to be invested in. The second thing is recognising that play work as a profession. Play workers training should be part of everybody who works in childcare. I was deputy head of a children's centre. Kids are in there from 8 till 6, sometimes 5 days a week. They're not always part of the nursery education, as June knows very well. Sometimes they are just playing, and training in play work is just as important as training in childcare. How do we keep it?
I mean, I am thinking, sitting here, it's fantastic ideas. We could shut this door and solve the problem, is my sense. But I worry about the politics of it. I mean, what I'm sort of hearing is that there's massive complexity. June said there are 55 different funding streams that she now has had to employ somebody to access, which you can only do if you're a large-scale, not-for-profit or commercial company. You cannot do that as the Chalk Valley Play School. Should we not just give it to the nurseries or give it to the parents? I mean, I'm thinking about the headline in the Daily Mirror. If we said, all the money's going to parents, you know where the demand is, you know what you want to do with your child. There's provision for the most deprived families, because we all know that Sure Start centres, great idea, have had a real problem accessing some of those families that need the care most. What is the right and the politically, doable solution to this?
I'd like to bring Helen in here, because you've looked at all the data from around Europe. I mean, if you were going to
start again,
if you were going to wave a magic wand and say this is the best way to do the system, what would it be?
Right, well, I think it has to be built around the education system, because that's where every child goes.
You can't hear at the back.
Sorry, education, that's the answer. The education system is for all children, and you can build around it. I mean, using a personal anecdote, my grandchildren go to a school with a breakfast club and an out-of-school club and various holiday play schemes, and they have their grandfather to fall back on if none of it works. And it's a much better arrangement than trying to buy into this scheme over here and that scheme over there and so on. We could reconstruct the education system to make it much more flexible, and that's how the most successful countries have done it.
And that is what's happening. Again, schools are starting to do that, and actually play schools are starting to affiliate with education schools and buy in buses.
Well, Claire, I think in theory, yes, as the governor of a primary school, I think it's a total mess. I mean, I've been trying to bring in this kind of more wraparound stuff within our primary school, and there are so many conflicting providers in our area that we're being told, oh no, if you do that then this nursery is going to shut down. The parents are really confused about what the offering is. I think that it's not as easy as just going, oh, it's happening. It really isn't, and there are huge breaks in the system against it, and there's a massive resistance in many schools towards a charging model. So I'm saying our school's we're in Camden Council, we're getting cut, I think about maybe up to 30% in the year. And so one way of increasing revenue stream is to have more of a kind of private nursery provision. But trying to get that past the governors or the teachers or this whole funding thing, they're like, no, we don't.
The madness is that we're spending $7 billion to give to parents, so it's not really a private funding model, it's an inefficient funding model that's filtering through the family and through a whole number of providers to get to your nursery.
Well, we're pushing, taxpayers are pushing a huge amount of money into childcare, which is going off into child benefit, nursery funding, bits in schools. It's too piecemeal, and we need to have a revolution in how it's all put together.
Not to take over, but this is a room full of practitioners. What do people, really from Helen's idea, and who here would support the idea of wrapping into the school model if we were going to start again? Who thinks that's a really bad idea? We should keep with an individual system. Can't
It's a
tell.
very good idea.
It's a good idea.
No, I don't think it's a very good idea.
You don't?
The education thing.
Why not?
Because I'm have been and are again a provider of private nurseries. Self-interest.
So would it be cheaper and easier for the parents and for the kids and stuff if that
I
was
can
the way
see
it
some
worked?
advantages. I think you're glossing over the practical difficulties, and some of the practical difficulties are the same practical difficulties that we have starting up a new setting. You know, I was in this 15 years ago and co-founded a chain which eventually is still going as part of another much bigger group, and I'm also back in it now. And you know, the change over that period has been enormous. It's so much more expensive now to commission property. Gold plating of building regulations, you know, everything has just gone up by far more than you'd expect. Of course, we expect more and better settings than 15 years ago. It goes without saying, but there's so much that's being chucked at it. The business rates the lady mentioned, now they were insignificant 15 years ago. They were usually negligible. Now, sort of valued as by valuation officers, fully commercial and.
I think you
all
should
these
be
sorts of
looking
things.
at that.
Anyway, sorry, I can go on.
Okay, well, can I just say, if it is attached to the school, you can get the school staff to do overtime, you can use the school hall and the school playgrounds, and it's all just much more sensible. The kids don't have to shift around. If it's sufficiently relaxed, they like it. My granddaughter certainly likes going. They cook, they cook.
I can see problems with that as well.
I'm really desperate to say I slightly disagree with you, Ellen. I work in the children's center, which was recently amalgamated. The children's center and the show staff was really perfectly organized. It was an excellence. It was granted an excellency award for doing a real good job. Parents started to feel when the amalgamation came to place, education took over, and then it has to be education, and parents didn't like it. And parents then started going into private setting. And you need to empower parents, you need to give them the choice to choose where they want the children to go, where they're comfortable with. That's the important
Okay,
thing.
the stats from the UK show that poor parents will use nursery education, but they won't use private nurseries.
They can't afford it.
So I mean, this goes back to the opening point, which is what is it for?
Yes, exactly.
And if the purpose of putting all this state money in is to try and increase the life chances of those from very deprived families, then probably through the education sector may be a good way of doing it. Lady in purple.
Claire Stephen, National Day Nurseries Association. I think just to go back to what's it for and the kind of discussions about quality, I think one of the things that we really need to think about, which is probably the most challenging, is actually the pay and conditions of the workforce in early years and after school childcare. And if we're saying it's expensive now and how does the country afford it, actually that's all founded on people who are paid from minimum wage.
Yeah,
And June and I know well, don't we, because we've been to low pay commission, and I've just had the invitation again to go back this year to talk about low pay in the nursery sector. So it is something we need to factor in if we want to actually have that quality provision for children.
Thank you. Lady at the back.
Hi, I'm Laura Courtney from Every Disabled Child Matters. Families with disabled children say they can't find high quality childcare they're confident to leave their children in and that they can afford. How do we fix that?
Can I tell you an anecdote about
Yes.
One of our nurseries is downstairs in the basement in Fitzrovia, and it's the most unkind of suitable place for a child with a physical disability. It's perfectly suitable for any other child. And this parent came to us, and she was in such a state, and she was a very well-to-do florist. We didn't know who she was, but apparently she's very well known. And she turned up this lovely little child and said, "I've been rejected by 4 nurseries. Please, will you take her?" And this is a child with cerebral palsy. Well, I said, of course we'll take her. She's only 2. We can carry her down the stairs. What's the issue? And she paid us double. She was so grateful. And I thought, in 2010 this was. How shocking. How shocking. And we've just had a big run-in with one of our children's centres, because I've actually opted out so that I can do all multi-generational things. I have grandparents in there, I have after school, I have relationship counselling, anything goes in my place, because that's what people want. And nobody can tell me not to do it, you see, because that's the thing about being a social enterprise. And so there's a kind of freedom around that. And one of the head teachers, very nice woman, very well-meaning, but she's determined to try and close down the workshops for the families with children with special needs. Now, only one morning a week do they have time to be on their own, to be able to grieve for their children and stuff. And she's insisting that it should be all-inclusive. Well, it's inclusive the rest of the week, but I'm kind of with the parents on this, and so I think there's a real debate to be had about what is it we want for children, what does it need to look like. And I mean, if I had a magic wand, I'd do 1 to 6 statutory. I'm going to try and do something kind of like that with the academy in our local school. That's because he's an Irish head teacher, and so we get on all right. But I mean, much of that depends on the head teacher as well. I mean, there's a lot of resistance from head teachers.
Yeah, there really is.
Completely, because I think they're nervous, and frankly, I'm with them sometimes. I mean, you know, their job is to run a good school. They really can't be all things to all men, and in fact, 90% of the benefit comes from home, only 10%. So when you read the paper and you say the schools failed here and the schools failed, like, the schools can't fix what's broken. It's a whole society thing we need to think about. And then we get it right, and then we transfer for our older people. Because everything we can do in the nursery, we can do for the older people.
I think that's the end of our time. I'm really sorry. I know there's lots of, it's just getting good. I know there's lots more to say, but thanks very much. Thanks to our brilliant panel, and thanks to all of you for coming.